The village of Meadowbrook possessed that particular quality of English tranquility that often conceals the most extraordinary secrets. Nestled in a gentle valley between rolling hills, it was the sort of place where the church bells chimed with reassuring regularity, where the postman knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves, and where the most scandalous event in recent memory had been the dispute over Mrs. Henderson's prize roses at the summer flower show. It was, as Miss Jane Marple well knew from her extensive observation of human nature, precisely the type of community where murder might flourish beneath a veneer of respectability. On this particular Wednesday afternoon in late September, the golden autumn light filtered through the ancient oak trees surrounding Rosemere House, casting dappled shadows across the immaculate gardens where Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth held her weekly tea gathering. The tradition had been established some 15 years earlier, when Mrs. Ashworth had first arrived in Meadowbrook as a widow of considerable means and decided that the village society required proper cultivation. Her Wednesday teas had since become as fixed in the local calendar as Sunday service, and nearly as well attended. Miss Marple sat in a comfortable chintz armchair near the French windows, her knitting needles clicking with gentle precision as she worked on a soft lavender cardigan for her great niece. To any casual observer, she appeared to be simply another elderly lady enjoying the social occasion, her white hair neatly arranged, her blue eyes occasionally lifting from her work to follow the conversation with polite interest. Those few who knew Miss Marple's reputation for solving mysteries might have recognized the particular quality of attention she paid to the assembled company, but in Meadowbrook she was merely a visiting friend of Mrs. Ashworth's late cousin, invited to stay for a few weeks while recovering from a minor bout of influenza. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth herself was a handsome woman in her early 60s, with silver hair elegantly coiffed and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. She had established herself as the undisputed social leader of Meadowbrook through a combination of genuine charity work, impeccable entertaining, and a gift for making others feel that her approval was worth seeking. This afternoon, however, there was a subtle tension in her manner that Miss Marple's experienced eye did not fail to notice. "I do think the new curate shows promise," Mrs. Ashworth was saying as she poured tea from an exquisite Georgian silver service. Though his sermon last Sunday was perhaps a trifle modern in its approach, one does like a certain gravitas in matters of faith. "Oh, I quite agree," murmured Miss Violet Pemberton, the village's retired schoolmistress, whose gentle manner concealed a sharp intelligence and an encyclopedic knowledge of local genealogies. "Though I must say, the young people seem to respond to his enthusiasm. My nephew Timothy mentioned that several of his friends have started attending evening service." The third regular member of the tea circle was Dr. Marcus Fleming, Meadowbrook's physician for the past 20 years. A tall, scholarly man with graying temples and keen dark eyes, he had the comfortable authority of someone who had delivered half the village's children and tended their grandparents in their final illnesses. He sat near the fireplace, balancing his teacup with the careful precision of large hands accustomed to delicate work. "Youth requires guidance, not indulgence," observed the fourth member of the party, Mrs. Ashworth's nephew, David Ashworth. He was a man in his late 30s, well-dressed but with the slightly strained look of someone whose income did not quite match his aspirations. He had been staying with his aunt for the past 6 months, ostensibly helping to manage her various business interests while his own financial affairs were reorganized following some unspecified difficulties in London. The final guest was a newcomer to these intimate gatherings, Miss Catherine Thornfield, who had arrived in Meadowbrook just 2 months earlier to serve as Mrs. Ashworth's companion and secretary. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with dark hair severely arranged and an air of nervous efficiency that suggested someone eager to please but uncertain of her position. Miss Marple had observed her carefully over the past weeks and detected the particular strain that came from living in a household where one's security depended entirely upon the goodwill of a single, rather formidable employer. The conversation flowed along its usual channels: parish affairs, village gossip, the declining standards of modern society, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension that had not been present at previous gatherings. Mrs. Ashworth's smile seemed forced. David's attempts at charm were more pronounced than usual, and Miss Thornfield appeared to be fighting a losing battle with her nerves, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted her cup of tea. It was as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4:30 that Mrs. Ashworth made her announcement. "I've asked you all here today," she began, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision, "because I have an important matter to discuss. I've decided to make significant changes to my will." The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled for just a moment before resuming their gentle rhythm. She noted the way David's face went carefully blank, the sharp intake of breath from Miss Thornfield, and the slight frown that creased Dr. Fleming's brow. "Indeed, Aunt Cordelia," David said, his voice admirably controlled. "May I ask what has prompted this decision?" Mrs. Ashworth's smile was thin and not entirely pleasant. "Let us say that recent observations have led me to reconsider certain assumptions about loyalty and gratitude. I've arranged to meet with Mr. Pettigrew, my solicitor, tomorrow morning to formalize the new arrangements." She paused, her gaze moving deliberately from face to face. "I thought it only fair to give advance notice to those who might be affected by these changes." Miss Thornfield had gone quite pale, her cup rattling against its saucer as she set it down. "Mrs. Ashworth, if I have done anything to displease you—" "My dear Catherine," Mrs. Ashworth interrupted, "this is not a discussion. It is merely an announcement. The decisions have been made." Dr. Fleming cleared his throat diplomatically. "Cordelia, are you quite certain this is the appropriate time for such matters? Perhaps when you're feeling less. That is to say, when you've had time to consider." "I am in perfect health, Marcus, and my mind is entirely clear," Mrs. Ashworth replied crisply. "In fact, I have rarely felt more certain about anything in my life." Miss Marple observed this exchange with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly complex pattern in her knitting. She had witnessed similar scenes before, in drawing rooms and parlours across England, where family fortunes and personal securities hung in the balance of an elderly relative's whims. The dynamics were always the same. The desperate dependence of those who had built their lives around an inheritance, the power wielded by those who controlled the purse strings, and the inevitable tensions that arose when that power was threatened or redistributed. The tea party concluded earlier than usual, with polite but strained farewells. David excused himself to attend to correspondence, his jaw set in a hard line. Miss Thornfield disappeared upstairs, claiming a sudden headache. Dr. Fleming lingered briefly to speak with Mrs. Ashworth in low, concerned tones before taking his leave. Miss Pemberton offered to help clear the tea things, but was gently dismissed. Miss Marple was the last to depart, gathering her knitting with unhurried movements as Mrs. Ashworth walked her to the front door. "Such a lovely afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Your roses are particularly beautiful this year, though I couldn't help noticing that the white climbing rose by the garden gate seems to have some sort of blight. You might want to have the gardener look at it." Mrs. Ashworth glanced toward the garden with a slight frown. "I hadn't noticed anything wrong with it." "Oh, it's very subtle," Miss Marple assured her. "Just a slight discoloration on some of the newer growth, but these things can spread so quickly if not attended to promptly. Prevention, as they say, is worth a pound of cure." She paused at the doorway, her mild blue eyes meeting Mrs. Ashworth's sharp grey ones. "You know, my dear, this reminds me of a situation we had in St. Mary Mead some years ago. A gentleman who announced his intention to change his will at a family gathering. Such an unfortunate business that followed. People do react so strangely when their expectations are adjusted." Mrs. Ashworth's expression hardened slightly. "I'm not concerned about other people's reactions, Jane. I've made my decision based on what I consider to be just and appropriate." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "though I do hope you'll be careful. Sometimes, when we disturb the established order of things, We set in motion consequences we hadn't anticipated. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her comfortable room at the village inn, she reflected on the afternoon's events while working on her knitting by lamplight. The patterns of human behavior were, she had long ago discovered, remarkably consistent across different times and places. Greed, fear, desperation, and wounded pride were powerful motivators, and when combined with opportunity and perceived necessity, they could drive even the most respectable people to extraordinary actions. She had particularly noted the way Miss Thornfield's hands had shaken when Mrs. Ashworth made her announcement, and the careful control with which David had received the news. Both reactions suggested people with much to lose and few alternatives. Dr. Fleming's concern seemed genuine, but Miss Marple had learned not to discount anyone too quickly. Physicians, after all, had both opportunity and knowledge that could prove useful in certain circumstances. The following morning dawned grey and misty, with the promise of rain in the heavy clouds that hung over Meadowbrook's gentle hills. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and took a quiet walk through the village before breakfast. She found herself drawn to Rosemere House, where she paused by the garden gate to examine the climbing rose she had mentioned the previous afternoon. It was as she stood there, ostensibly concerned with horticultural matters, that young Sally Briggs, Mrs. Ashworth's housemaid, came running down the front path in considerable distress. "Oh, Miss Marple," Sally gasped, her face flushed and her cap askew. "I'm that glad to see you. Something terrible has happened. Mrs. Ashworth is gone." Miss Marple set down her walking stick and gave the girl her full attention. "Gone, my dear? What do you mean exactly?" "She's not in her room, miss, and her bed hasn't been slept in. I brought up her morning tea at 7, just like always, but she wasn't there. I've searched the whole house. She's nowhere to be found." "Have you informed Mr. David?" "He's not here either, miss. His room's empty too, and his motor car's gone from the garage. And Miss Thornfield, she's in such a state, crying and carrying on, saying it's all her fault somehow." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind was already working through the implications. "Show me Mrs. Ashworth's room, Sally. But first, has anyone else been notified?" "Miss Thornfield sent word to Dr. Fleming, miss. He should be here any moment." As they walked up the front path, Miss Marple noticed something that made her pause. On the perfectly maintained gravel drive, barely visible unless one was looking carefully, were the faint impressions of footprints leading from the house toward the garden. But more interesting still was what lay half hidden beneath the climbing rose she had examined the day before. A small pearl button, the kind used on expensive ladies' gloves. "Sally," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think we should also send for Inspector Craddock from Much Benham. This may be a matter that requires official attention." For Miss Marple had learned, over her many years of observing human nature in all its complexity, that when people disappeared after making dramatic announcements about changing their wills, the explanation was rarely as simple as it first appeared, and something about the careful arrangement of evidence, the unsept-in bed, the missing nephew, the strategically placed button, suggested that Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's disappearance had been planned by someone other than herself. The lady had indeed vanished after her final tea, but Miss Marple suspected that the true story of that vanishing would prove to be far more complex and considerably more sinister than anyone yet realized. By 8:30, Rosemere House had transformed from a bastion of village respectability into the epicenter of Meadowbrook's most scandalous mystery in living memory. The morning mist clung to the windows like gossamer curtains, softening the harsh reality that Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth had simply vanished into the grey September dawn. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham with the methodical efficiency that had earned him respect throughout the county. A weathered man in his late 40s, he possessed the patient demeanor of someone who understood that rural crimes were rarely as straightforward as they appeared. He found Miss Marple in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she observed the household's mounting distress, with her characteristic blend of sympathy and shrewd assessment. Miss Catherine Thornfield sat collapsed on the settee, clutching a sodden handkerchief and periodically dissolving into fresh sobs. Her distress appeared genuine, though Miss Marple had learned long ago that authentic emotion and authentic innocence were entirely separate matters. The companion's hands shook as she recounted the previous evening's events for perhaps the 5th time. Mrs. Ashworth retired at her usual hour, Miss Thornfield repeated, her voice trembling. I heard her moving about until 10:30. I assumed she was preparing for bed as normal. My room is at the far end of the corridor, and I sleep quite soundly. If there was any disturbance, I heard nothing. Dr. Fleming arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag clutched tightly and his usually calm demeanor visibly fractured. This is madness, he declared, removing his spectacles to polish them, with nervous precision, a habit Miss Marple had already catalogued as occurring whenever he was troubled. Cordelia missing, and David's car gone as well. Inspector Craddock's examination of Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom revealed a scene of almost aggressive tidiness. The bed remained pristine, its counterpane unwrinkled. On the dressing table lay her silver-backed brush set, folded handkerchief, and gold reading spectacles. Her jewel case sat locked and undisturbed. Nothing appears to have been taken, Miss Thornfield observed. Her passport, checkbook, everything remains. Only her handbag and coat are missing. Miss Marple approached the bedside table with particular interest. How curious, she murmured, indicating a leather-bound novel. Mrs. Ashworth always placed her evening reading with the spine facing outward. She said it was proper to see the title, yet here it faces inward. Someone else placed this book. Moving to the window, she noted a small brown stain on the sill. Rust from the old fastenings, Dr. Fleming suggested, but Miss Marple's experienced eye recognized garden soil, the crumbly earth that clung to shoes on damp nights. In the morning room, they discovered Mrs. Ashworth's unfinished letter to her solicitor. The cream paper bore her precise handwriting. I've quite made up my mind to provide differently for certain members of my family. The sentence broke off abruptly, the pen abandoned mid-thought. Meanwhile, news of the disappearance spread through Meadowbrook with viral efficiency. At the post office, Mrs. Higgins dispensed theories along with stamps. Mark my words, it's the nephew, she declared to anyone within earshot. Saw him driving like a maniac past the duck pond. Face like thunder he had. The baker contradicted her timing, claiming he'd seen David's motor car at dawn, not midnight. Such discrepancies only fueled further speculation, and by noon the village had cycled through 3 competing theories: elopement, murder, and conspiracy. Inspector Craddock's methodical search revealed additional troubling details. Near the bottom of the main staircase, a fresh gouge marred the polished oak banister. Embedded in the Persian runner's thick pile, Miss Marple discovered a tiny shard of blue Wedgwood china. Mrs. Ashworth's evening cocoa cup. She identified immediately. She always took it at 9:30 precisely. If someone cleaned up broken crockery and missed this fragment, it suggests the incident occurred after her usual bedtime routine, Craddock concluded grimly. Miss Marple fingered the pearl button she'd found in the garden, considering its implications. We're assuming David is our primary suspect because he's conveniently absent, she observed. But Mrs. Ashworth's announcement yesterday was calculated to provoke. The question remains, did she provoke her intended target, or did she accidentally corner a much more dangerous animal? A dangerous animal, the inspector repeated. The most treacherous kind, Miss Marple replied, her tone deceptively mild. One that's cornered, panicked, and wearing an utterly respectable face. Someone who couldn't afford to let that will be changed. Someone intimately familiar with this household's routines. Outside, Autumn rain began washing away any remaining evidence, sealing Meadowbrook in grey, watery silence, while its most prominent citizen remained mysteriously absent. By lunchtime, Meadowbrook's efficient gossip network had transformed Mrs. Ashworth's disappearance into the village's most thoroughly analysed mystery since the Norman conquest. Miss Marple, observing this phenomenon from her corner table at the Rose and Crown, marvelled at how quickly speculation had crystallized into accepted fact, each retelling adding fresh embellishments like layers of paint on an old fence. Miss Violet Pemberton arrived bearing intelligence gathered during her morning constitutional, settling opposite Miss Marple with the satisfied air of a successful reconnaissance mission. "I've made some rather disturbing discoveries about our missing hostess," she announced, accepting tea with practiced efficiency. "According to Mrs. Higgins at the post office, Mrs. Ashworth sent an urgent telegram yesterday morning to a Mr. Silas Vane in London." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. "How very interesting, and the nature of this correspondence?" "Most revealing," Miss Pemberton continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. The message read, "Knowing what I know now, cannot proceed. Arrangement cancelled. Letter follows. Mrs. Higgins's nephew works in the city and recognizes the name. Mr. Vane is a private investigator specializing in delicate family matters." This revelation cast Mrs. Ashworth's tea party announcement in an entirely new light. Her decision to alter her will had not been based on mere whim or general dissatisfaction, but on specific, documented evidence obtained through professional investigation. The implications were staggering. Someone in her intimate circle had been living under false pretenses, and Mrs. Ashworth had discovered their deception. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock's methodical investigation had uncovered additional complications. The discovery of Mrs. Ashworth's handbag in a hedgerow half a mile from Rosemere House provided both answers and fresh questions. While its contents remained intact, purse, keys, handkerchief, careful examination revealed traces of garden soil on the clasp, matching samples from the bedroom windowsill. Someone had carried the bag through the garden before abandoning it, but whether from panic or calculated misdirection remained unclear. "The leather shows signs of having been wiped clean," Miss Marple observed, turning the bag carefully in her hands during Craddock's examination. "Yet soil traces remain on the metal clasp. Either our perpetrator was hasty in their cleanup, or they wanted us to find this evidence in precisely this location." Dr. Fleming's afternoon visit to Rosemere House provided another troubling piece of the puzzle. "I feel compelled to mention something that's been weighing on my conscience," he confessed to Inspector Craddock, his usual composure visibly strained. 2 weeks ago, Cordelia consulted me about persistent headaches and moments of confusion. She wondered if someone might be tampering with her evening cocoa. I dismissed it as nervous fancy, but given recent events... "Did she suspect anyone specifically?" Craddock inquired sharply. The doctor's hesitation spoke volumes. She mentioned that Miss Thornfield had recently begun preparing her cocoa personally, claiming the kitchen staff made it too weak. Cordelia found this attention somewhat oppressive, but didn't wish to seem ungrateful to someone in such a precarious position. When confronted with this information, Miss Thornfield's carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely. "Yes, I prepared her cocoa," she admitted through fresh tears, "but only because she complained constantly about the maid's preparation. I was trying to be helpful, to secure my position. She'd hinted several times that she might not require a companion much longer." The discovery of David Ashworth's abandoned motor car near Much Benham railway station complicated matters further. No witnesses recalled seeing either David or Mrs. Ashworth board any train. Yet the vehicle's interior revealed David's driving gloves folded neatly on the passenger seat, an oddly meticulous detail for someone fleeing in panic. As evening shadows lengthened across Meadowbrook, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations while working her knitting by lamplight. The pattern emerging was far more complex than a simple inheritance dispute. Mrs. Ashworth had hired a private investigator, discovered something significant enough to cancel the arrangement, announced her intention to change her will, and then vanished. Someone had been clever enough to manipulate evidence while leaving just enough traces to suggest alternative narratives. The most dangerous criminals, Miss Marple murmured to herself, are those who understand that the best lies contain substantial elements of truth. Someone is being very clever indeed, and that troubles me considerably more than mere passion or greed ever could. Outside, the autumn rain continued its relentless assault, washing away physical evidence while the village's most prominent citizen remained mysteriously absent, leaving behind only questions wrapped in increasingly elaborate deceptions. The morning brought Inspector Craddock's return with news that transformed the investigation's entire complexion. David Ashworth had been located in London, not fleeing to the continent as village gossip suggested, but sitting in a police station voluntarily, his appearance haggard and his story both elaborate and troubling. He claims he received an anonymous telephone call Tuesday evening, Craddock explained to Miss Marple as they stood in Mrs. Ashworth's morning room. Someone warned him his aunt was in danger and arranged to meet him at the old gamekeeper's cottage on the Thornley estate. When he arrived at midnight, no one appeared, but he heard a motor car starting in the distance. Upon returning to where he'd left his vehicle, he discovered it missing. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. How very convenient for someone to lure him away at precisely the right moment. And his subsequent actions? He spent the night at a small inn under an assumed name, then came forward yesterday morning. His story is either genuine distress or remarkably calculated deception. Craddock's expression remained skeptical. What troubles me is how perfectly it explains his absence while providing no verifiable details. The inspector's investigation had yielded another significant discovery. Among Mrs. Ashworth's private papers, carefully filed in her desk drawer, lay correspondence with the London investigator Silas Vane. The letters revealed that Mrs. Ashworth had hired him not to investigate David's finances, but to look into suspected theft within her own household. Someone had been systematically stealing from her over 6 months, forging signatures on checks and accessing her personal accounts. The amounts were initially modest, Miss Marple observed, examining the documented evidence. £20 here, 50 there. But recently the thefts escalated dramatically. Mrs. Ashworth was clearly building a case against someone she trusted implicitly. More disturbing still was the revelation that Vane's final report had indeed arrived by registered post, signed for by Miss Thornfield on Tuesday morning. Yet when confronted, the companion insisted she had never seen such a document, claiming she signed automatically for all registered mail without examining contents closely. A systematic search of the house revealed the missing report's envelope, carefully concealed behind volumes in the library bookcase. The contents, however, had been removed entirely. Someone had intercepted Vane's findings before Mrs. Ashworth could read them, suggesting the investigator had identified the thief conclusively. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the village pharmacy proved illuminating in ways she hadn't anticipated. While purchasing throat lozenges, she engaged Mr. Abernathy in casual conversation about sleep remedies and their proper usage. Curious thing, the pharmacist confided, Miss Thornfield came in last week for Mrs. Ashworth's usual sleeping draught refill, but she also purchased a substantial quantity of chloral hydrate. Claimed it was for severe toothache, though the amount seemed excessive for that purpose. This information cast Miss Thornfield's tearful admissions about preparing evening cocoa in an entirely new light. Chloral hydrate, tasteless in chocolate and powerfully sedating, would render someone unconscious within minutes. Yet Miss Thornfield lacked both the physical strength and transportation means to remove an unconscious woman from Rosemere House, alone. The afternoon brought another development that further complicated the emerging picture. A gamekeeper reported discovering disturbed earth near the abandoned cottage where David claimed to have been lured, along with a woman's glove bearing Mrs. Ashworth's initials. The excavated area revealed nothing sinister, but the careful pattern of disturbance suggested someone had been searching systematically, or creating that impression. Someone is being remarkably thorough in establishing multiple narrative threads, Miss Marple observed to Inspector Craddock. David's mysterious summons, evidence of theft, sedative purchases, disturbed grave sites. Each element supports different theories while none provides definitive answers. Her suspicions crystallized during an encounter with Dr. Fleming near the church. His usually composed demeanor showed distinct strain, and his questions about the investigation's progress seemed more pointed than casual interest warranted. "The police seem convinced David is responsible," he mentioned, his voice carefully neutral. "His financial troubles and sudden flight certainly suggest guilt." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I find myself wondering why someone would flee so obviously if they'd been clever enough to stage such an elaborate deception. The evidence against David feels almost deliberately constructed. Too convenient, too visible." As evening approached, the discovery of Mrs. Ashworth's silk gardening scarf snagged on brambles near the old quarry, 3 miles from the railway station, shattered the timeline supporting David's guilt entirely. If he had driven to Much Benham at dawn, he couldn't simultaneously have transported evidence to the quarry in the opposite direction. Someone had been very busy indeed, creating false trails and manipulating evidence with surgical precision. The question remained, who possessed both the knowledge to intercept investigative reports, the medical expertise to administer sedatives safely? Miss Marple suspected the answer lay closer to home than anyone yet realized. The discovery of Mrs. Ashworth's silk scarf near the abandoned quarry marked a turning point in the investigation, though not in the way Inspector Craddock initially supposed. Miss Marple accompanied the search party with her customary air of mild interest, yet her sharp eyes immediately detected what others missed entirely. "Notice how perfectly positioned everything appears," she observed quietly, to the inspector as they examined the cave entrance concealed behind overgrown brambles. Inside lay what appeared to be a makeshift refuge. Blankets, tinned provisions, and Mrs. Ashworth's jewelry displayed with suspicious neatness. The scarf caught at precisely eye level, this cave arranged like a theatrical set. Someone wants us to believe Mrs. Ashworth fled here, yet nothing shows genuine signs of occupation. Her suspicions proved prophetic when Inspector Craddock received a telephone call from London that afternoon. Mr. Silas Vane, the private investigator, had finally agreed to share one crucial detail from his final report. The embezzler he'd identified was definitively not David Ashworth. This revelation shattered the neat narrative of nephew murders aunt for inheritance, forcing them to reconsider every assumption about motive and opportunity. Then all this elaborate staging around David's movements serves an entirely different purpose, Miss Marple concluded, her knitting needles clicking thoughtfully. Someone needed him absent and apparently guilty while they accomplished something else entirely. The afternoon brought disturbing revelations about the household's medical connections. Mrs. Pringle, the village cleaning woman whose observational skills rivaled any detective's, reported discovering burn marks in Dr. Fleming's surgery grate, unusual for September weather. Among the incompletely destroyed papers, she'd glimpsed fragments of legal terminology, beneficiary and residue. More troubling still was Miss Marple's careful examination of Dr. Fleming's medical cabinet during her ostensible consultation about persistent coughs. The alphabetically arranged medications showed telltale gaps where drugs capable of inducing unconsciousness had been systematically removed. Fleming's defensive reaction when questioned about his organizational methods suggested he'd only recently discovered the theft. Someone with intimate knowledge of medical procedures has been preparing for this crime for weeks, Miss Marple realized. The question remains whether Dr. Fleming is the perpetrator covering his tracks, or whether someone has cleverly implicated him by stealing from his own supplies. The financial investigation yielded equally complex revelations. The forged checks hadn't been deposited under David's name or Miss Thornfield's, but rather into an account bearing the ingeniously constructed identity C.T. Ashworth, a deliberate amalgamation designed to implicate both suspects simultaneously. The signature bore characteristics of David's handwriting, yet with flourishes suggesting deliberate disguise. Miss Thornfield's testimony began crumbling under renewed scrutiny. Her account of Tuesday evening's events shifted subtly with each retelling, first claiming to hear Mrs. Ashworth moving about until 10:30, then reporting lights in her window at 11. When, confronted with these inconsistencies, her composure fractured entirely. "I may have been mistaken about the times," she stammered, wringing her hands. "Everything has become so confused. Perhaps I saw the lights earlier, or perhaps someone else was in her room." The most disturbing development came from a local farmer who reported seeing a woman matching Mrs. Ashworth's description walking unsteadily near the railway bridge Wednesday morning, hours after her supposed disappearance. The figure wore heavy clothing despite mild weather and appeared confused, disoriented. "If Mrs. Ashworth was alive Wednesday morning," Inspector Craddock mused, "then our entire timeline collapses." "Unless," Miss Marple interjected gently, "the woman seen wasn't Mrs. Ashworth at all. Consider who else possesses similar height and build, who might access her wardrobe, who could convincingly impersonate her at a distance." The implications were staggering. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to establish that Mrs. Ashworth remained alive after David's departure, requiring either genuine survival or masterful deception. Miss Marple suspected the latter, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to misdirect the investigation while the real crime proceeded according to plan. As evening shadows gathered over Meadowbrook, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. Multiple conspirators working in concert, each playing assigned roles in an elaborate deception. Medical knowledge, financial fraud, systematic evidence planting, and theatrical misdirection, all coordinated with surgical precision. The killer was confident, perhaps dangerously so, believing their trail of false clues had successfully baffled the authorities. But confidence, Miss Marple knew, often bred carelessness. It was time to stop merely observing and start actively provoking. Someone needed to believe their deception had been penetrated, their careful plans exposed. The lady who vanished after her final tea had carried within her disappearance the seeds of her destroyer's eventual exposure. The morning brought an unsettling quiet to Meadowbrook, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, observing this phenomenon from her window at the Rose and Crown, recognized the particular atmosphere that settled over communities when violent secrets lurked beneath their respectable surfaces. It was time, she decided, to apply gentle pressure to those secrets and observe what emerged. Her first visit was to Miss Thornfield, whom she found in Mrs. Ashworth's morning room, mechanically dusting furniture that showed no trace of neglect. The companion's movements possessed the frantic quality of someone seeking distraction from increasingly dark thoughts. "My dear Catherine," Miss Marple began, settling herself with her knitting, "I've been reflecting on your situation. A broken engagement is such a painful thing, particularly when one's position depends entirely upon another's goodwill." Miss Thornfield's hands stilled on the mantelpiece. "How did you— the pale band on your ring finger, dear, and the way you started when yesterday's post arrived, as if expecting unwelcome news. I imagine your former fiancé's letter seeking reconciliation must have been quite distressing, especially when Mrs. Ashworth discovered it." The companion's composure crumbled entirely. "She was cruel about it," Miss Thornfield whispered. "Said a woman dependent on charity had no business entertaining romantic notions. But I would never have harmed her, never." "Of course not," Miss Marple soothed, "though I suspect someone has been very clever in making you appear guilty of the embezzlement. Tell me, did you ever notice Dr. Fleming taking particular interest in Mrs. Ashworth's medical routine?" The question struck home. Miss Thornfield's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "He was always asking about her evening cocoa, whether she slept well. I thought it was professional concern, but now—" Miss Marple's afternoon brought a crucial revelation when Inspector Craddock returned from London with Silas Vane's complete report. The private investigator had indeed identified Miss Thornfield as the embezzler, but his investigation had accidentally uncovered something far more damaging. Evidence that Dr. Fleming had been systematically falsifying medical certificates for insurance claims, with Mrs. Ashworth's late husband among his victims 15 years earlier. The amounts involved were substantial, Craddock explained grimly. If Mrs. Ashworth had discovered this connection, Fleming faced not merely professional ruin, but potential prosecution for manslaughter. The pieces assembled with terrible logic. Fleming possessed medical knowledge, access to sedatives, and most critically, a motive powerful enough to justify murder. Yet the elaborate staging suggested he hadn't worked alone. This theory gained substance when young Sally Briggs finally summoned courage to share what she'd witnessed Tuesday night. "I saw Dr. Fleming and Miss Thornfield in the garden around midnight," she confessed, trembling. "They were arguing, and Miss Thornfield was crying. Then I saw them carrying something heavy between them toward the old greenhouse." The revelation transformed everything. Fleming and Thornfield working in concert explained the crime's dual nature. Medical expertise combined with intimate household knowledge. Financial fraud providing convenient alternative suspects. Elaborate staging compensating for Fleming's methodical nature with desperate creativity. They needed each other, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Craddock. Fleming had motive and means but required inside assistance. Thornfield faced exposure as an embezzler and saw opportunity in Fleming's desperation. Together, they created a crime designed to implicate everyone except themselves. The afternoon search of the greenhouse yielded disturbing evidence. Recently disturbed earth beneath the potting benches, traces of chloral hydrate on gardening tools, and most damning of all, Mrs. Ashworth's reading glasses carefully hidden behind flower pots. Yet something troubled Miss Marple about the discovery's convenient timing. "Notice how perfectly positioned everything appears," she observed to Inspector Craddock. "The glass is visible but not obvious, the chemical traces just detectable enough. Someone wants us to find this evidence now at precisely this moment in our investigation." As evening shadows lengthened across Rosemere House, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. The conspirators had been feeding the investigation carefully measured revelations, controlling its pace and direction, but their confidence was becoming their weakness. They believed themselves clever enough to manipulate both evidence and investigators indefinitely. Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Ashworth, drugged but possibly still alive when first hidden, had been moved multiple times as the investigation progressed. The greenhouse was merely another staging area in an elaborate shell game designed to keep authorities searching in circles while the real crime reached its conclusion. The lady who vanished after her final tea had become a pawn in a deadly game of misdirection, but Miss Marple intended to end that game very soon indeed. The morning brought a discovery that transformed the entire investigation, though not in the way Inspector Craddock had anticipated. Miss Marple, returning to Rosemere House to examine Mrs. Ashworth's personal effects with fresh eyes, noticed something peculiar about the portrait of the late Mr. Robert Ashworth hanging in the entrance hall. The heavy gilt frame hung slightly askew, revealing a faint rectangle of unfaded wallpaper behind it, evidence of recent disturbance. "Inspector," she called quietly to Craddock, who was coordinating the greenhouse search. "I believe we've been looking for Mrs. Ashworth's missing evidence in entirely the wrong places. Sometimes the most obvious hiding spots are overlooked precisely because they're so visible." Behind the portrait, taped securely to the backing paper, they discovered not Silas Vane's missing report, but something far more valuable: Mrs. Ashworth's private diary. The leather-bound volume contained 15 years of meticulous observations, newspaper clippings about suspicious deaths in Dr. Fleming's practice, and correspondence with medical authorities in other counties. Mrs. Ashworth hadn't merely suspected Fleming of recent embezzlement. She had been building a comprehensive case against him for medical malpractice spanning decades. The final entry, dated Tuesday afternoon just hours before her disappearance, read in her precise handwriting. The pattern is unmistakable now. Robert's symptoms, Mrs. Henderson's sudden decline, old Mr. Pettigrew's convenient heart failure, all patients who questioned Fleming's treatments or threatened his reputation. He thinks I don't recognize the taste of bitter almonds in my evening cocoa, but I remember that smell from Robert's final days. Tomorrow I meet with Vane to present everything to the authorities. Bitter almonds, Miss Marple murmured, her expression grave. The distinctive odor of cyanide poisoning, but Mrs. Ashworth was too clever to drink anything she suspected was tainted. She was testing her suspicions, letting Fleming believe his deception was working while she gathered final proof. This revelation cast David Ashworth's role in an entirely different light. When confronted with the diary's contents, he broke down completely, his carefully maintained composure crumbling into genuine distress. I was the one who urged Aunt Cordelia to hire Vane, he confessed. I'd noticed discrepancies in the household accounts months ago, not embezzlement, but Fleming's medical bills seemed excessive. I thought he was overcharging for medications, nothing more sinister. The irony was devastating. David's innocent attempt to protect his aunt's finances had inadvertently triggered the investigation that exposed Fleming's far more serious crimes. His mysterious summons to the gamekeeper's cottage hadn't been random misdirection, but a calculated move to remove the one person who could corroborate Mrs. Ashworth's suspicions about the medical bills. Inspector Craddock's renewed interrogation of Miss Thornfield, armed with this understanding, finally penetrated her terrified denials. Dr. Fleming came to the house Tuesday evening after everyone departed. She sobbed, her carefully maintained composure dissolving entirely. He said he needed to speak with Mrs. Ashworth urgently about her medication. I let him in through the garden entrance. He was her physician. I saw no harm. "What did you witness?" Miss Marple asked gently, settling beside the distraught woman with maternal concern. I heard raised voices from her bedroom, then sudden silence. When I went to investigate, Fleming was descending the stairs carrying his medical bag and Mrs. Ashworth's coat. He told me she'd taken ill and required immediate hospitalization at his private clinic, that her condition was delicate and required absolute discretion. "But you suspected something was wrong?" Miss Thornfield nodded miserably. Her face was so pale and she seemed barely conscious. But Fleming knew about the checks I'd forged. Small amounts over months. I was desperate to pay my debts. He said if I questioned his treatment or spoke to anyone, he'd ensure I was prosecuted for theft. He claimed Mrs. Ashworth would recover fully once his situation was resolved, that she was merely sedated for her own protection. The revelation sent shock waves through the investigation. Fleming's private clinic, ostensibly serving elderly patients requiring discreet medical care, suddenly became the focus of urgent scrutiny. The facility's records showed no admission for Mrs. Ashworth, but Miss Marple's careful examination of the building's layout revealed recently installed locks on cellar storage rooms and suspicious modifications to the ventilation system. "He's been maintaining her in a drugged state," Miss Marple realized with growing horror. All this elaborate staging, the greenhouse evidence, the quarry discoveries, even implicating David, was designed to keep us occupied while he searched for and destroyed Mrs. Ashworth's accumulated evidence against him. The terrible logic of Fleming's position became clear. He had trapped himself in an impossible situation, unable to release Mrs. Ashworth without facing immediate prosecution for multiple murders, yet unable to maintain her indefinitely without arousing fatal suspicion. His medical knowledge had enabled the crime, but also made him prisoner to its consequences. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Meadowbrook, Miss Marple reflected on the escalating desperation that had driven a respected physician to such monstrous acts. Fleming's original crimes had been calculated murders disguised as natural deaths, but Mrs. Ashworth's investigation had forced him into increasingly frantic improvisation. The lady who vanished after her final tea remained alive somewhere, drugged and helpless, while her captor frantically sought to complete what medical arrogance had begun decades earlier. "We must move quickly," Miss Marple told Inspector Craddock as they prepared to search Fleming's clinic. His supplies of sedatives must be running dangerously low by now, and a man of his methodical nature will have prepared a final solution to his dilemma. Mrs. Ashworth's time is running out. The raid on Dr. Fleming's private clinic proceeded with the methodical precision that Inspector Craddock had learned to employ in Miss Marple's presence. The facility occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Meadowbrook's quiet outskirts, its brass nameplate and manicured grounds projecting an aura of medical respectability that had served Fleming's purposes for over 2 decades. Miss Marple accompanied the inspection with her characteristic air of mild interest, though her sharp eyes catalogued every detail of the establishment's layout. The main floor appeared entirely legitimate. Spotless examination rooms, properly maintained patient records, and elderly residents receiving attentive care from uniformed staff. Yet subtle anomalies spoke volumes to her experienced observation. "Notice the newer locks on certain doors," she murmured quietly to Inspector Craddock as they moved through the corridors. "And observe how the staff carefully avoids mentioning the lower-level storage areas. Someone has trained them to maintain deliberate ignorance about portions of this establishment." Rather than conduct a dramatic confrontation that might provoke Fleming to desperate measures, Miss Marple suggested a more subtle approach. They would visit ostensibly regarding routine inquiries about controlled substances regulations, allowing Fleming to believe his primary deception remained undetected. Fleming appeared in the reception area within moments, his professional demeanor intact, though Miss Marple detected the telltale signs of strain around his eyes. His relief at Craddock's explanation about investigating medication thefts was palpable, confirming her suspicions that he expected far more serious accusations. While Craddock occupied the doctor with inventory discussions in his office, Miss Marple executed her carefully planned maneuver. Feigning a sudden dizzy spell, she requested water from the receptionist, then slipped unnoticed toward the locked storage areas she had observed earlier. At the corridor's end, a heavy oak door bore sophisticated new locks that seemed excessive for mere medical supplies. More significantly, her trained ear detected faint sounds from within, the shallow rhythmic breathing of someone in chemically induced unconsciousness. Returning to the reception area as Fleming emerged with Craddock, Miss Marple played her role with practiced innocence. "Oh, Doctor, I do apologize for this dizzy spell," she fluttered, leaning on her walking stick. "Perhaps I might rest in that quiet room at the corridor's end. It seemed so peaceful." Fleming's reaction was immediate and telling. "That area is undergoing renovation, not suitable for patients. Please remain in the main waiting area." His response confirmed everything Miss Marple needed to know. The excuse came too quickly, too defensively. She allowed herself to be settled in a chair, then delivered her carefully prepared psychological blow. "How peculiar," she observed, her voice carrying clearly through the reception area. "I detected the distinct odor of bitter almonds near that renovation work. Such a memorable scent. It reminds me of poor Mr. Robert Ashworth's final illness. His widow mentioned that same smell in her diary, the one we discovered hidden behind his portrait this morning." The effect was electric. Fleming's professional mask cracked visibly, his face draining of color as the implications struck home. The diary, the one piece of evidence he had desperately sought while maintaining Mrs. Ashworth in unconsciousness, contained not merely suspicions, but documented proof of his 15-year career in medical murder. "You are mistaken," Fleming whispered, his voice barely audible. "There are no such chemicals here. Mrs. Ashworth was delusional. That's why I had to treat her." "Treat her?" Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his tone hardening with sudden understanding. "Is that what you call it, Doctor? Where is she? We know she's behind that locked door." Fleming's desperate lunge toward his medical bag, undoubtedly containing a syringe prepared for just such an emergency, was intercepted by Craddock's quick reflexes. As officers swarmed the reception area, Miss Marple directed them toward the locked corridor with urgent precision. Quickly, Inspector. The breathing I detected was extremely shallow. He may have administered a final dose when he realized we had penetrated his deception. Breaking through the heavy door revealed Fleming's hidden chamber, a windowless room converted into a makeshift medical prison. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth lay on a narrow hospital bed, pale and unconscious, but unmistakably alive. Sophisticated medical equipment monitored her vital signs, while an intravenous drip maintained the precise chemical balance that had kept her hovering between consciousness and coma for days. She's been maintained on rotating combinations of barbiturates and chloral hydrate, the police surgeon confirmed, working quickly to stabilize her condition. Administered with considerable medical expertise to prevent fatal respiratory depression, Fleming's been keeping her balanced on a knife's edge, alive but helpless. As paramedics prepared Mrs. Ashworth for transport to the county hospital, Miss Marple examined Fleming's private notes discovered in the hidden room. His journals documented not merely recent crimes, but a systematic campaign spanning 15 years. Patients eliminated when they questioned his authority, threatened his reputation, or simply proved inconveniently knowledgeable about his methods. "The arrogance is breathtaking," she observed to Inspector Craddock as Fleming was led away in handcuffs, his professional dignity finally shattered. He believed his medical knowledge made him superior to everyone, his patients, the authorities, even his victims, but he underestimated Mrs. Ashworth's determination to protect others from suffering her husband's fate. The most chilling discovery was Fleming's systematic approach to victim selection. His journals revealed careful psychological profiles of potential targets, elderly patients with substantial assets, limited family connections, and trusting natures that made them vulnerable to his manipulations. Robert Ashworth's murder had been merely the first in a calculated series designed to fund Fleming's increasingly expensive lifestyle while eliminating anyone who might expose his methods. He kept her alive because he still hadn't found the evidence, Miss Marple realized, watching the ambulance disappear toward Much Benham General Hospital. Not from mercy, but from desperation. As long as she lived, he hoped to force her to reveal where she had hidden her proof. Her stubborn silence, even under heavy sedation, ultimately saved her life. The lady who vanished after her final tea had been discovered in the sterile confines of her captor's own medical prison, her ordeal ending not in the silence of death, but in the promise of justice finally served. Fleming's career in murder was concluded, his reputation destroyed, and his victims could finally rest in peace knowing their killer would face the consequences of his calculated cruelty. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to Meadowbrook, she reflected on the particular evil of professionals who perverted their trusted positions for personal gain. Fleming's crimes were made possible not by passion or desperation, but by the cold calculation of someone who believed his education and social standing placed him above moral accountability. Such criminals, she knew from long experience, were often the most dangerous precisely because their respectability made their crimes nearly invisible until someone with sufficient determination, like Mrs. Ashworth, decided to look beneath the surface of medical propriety and social respectability. The arrest of Dr. Fleming sent shock waves through Meadowbrook that reverberated through every cottage and drawing room like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Yet as Miss Marple sat in her familiar corner of the Rose and Crown that evening, her knitting needles clicking with thoughtful precision, she remained troubled by loose threads in the investigation's fabric that refused to be neatly woven together. Inspector Craddock joined her with visible relief etched across his weathered features. "Fleming has confessed to everything, the murders, the embezzlement, Mrs. Ashworth's kidnapping. He claims Miss Thornfield was merely coerced into silence through threats about her forged checks. The case appears closed." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mild blue eyes never leaving her knitting. "Though I find myself wondering about certain details that don't quite align with Fleming's narrative. A gentleman of the old school, despite his crimes, might well construct a story to spare a lady further distress, but does it truly account for everything we observed? She set down her needles with deliberate care. "Consider the timeline, Inspector. Young Sally witnessed Fleming and Miss Thornfield in the garden at midnight Tuesday, carrying something heavy between them toward the greenhouse. If Fleming had already sedated Mrs. Ashworth and intended to transport her to his clinic alone, why would he require assistance? And why move toward the greenhouse rather than his motor car?" The final confrontation. The following morning brought Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated resolution. She requested that Inspector Craddock arrange a small gathering at Rosemere House, ostensibly to discuss Mrs. Ashworth's eventual return from hospital. The participants assembled with varying degrees of reluctance. Miss Thornfield, pale and packed for departure. David Ashworth, still processing his aunt's survival. Miss Pemberton, representing the village's concerned curiosity. And Dr. Fleming's assistant, summoned under the pretext of clarifying medical arrangements. Miss Marple positioned herself by the morning-room fireplace, her knitting creating a deceptively domestic atmosphere as Inspector Craddock opened proceedings with official gravity. "We have reason to believe," Craddock announced, "that certain aspects of Mrs. Ashworth's disappearance remain unexplained. Someone in this room possesses additional information that could clarify the final details of this case." The immediate reactions proved illuminating. David appeared genuinely bewildered, Miss Pemberton drew herself up with offended dignity, and Fleming's assistant protested his innocence with convincing indignation. Only Miss Thornfield remained unnaturally still, her hands gripping her chair arms while her eyes stayed suspiciously dry despite the emotional strain of recent days. Miss Marple spoke into the rising tension with characteristic gentleness. "You see, we discovered something rather interesting in our final examination of the greenhouse. The soil beneath those potting benches contains bone meal, a substance that significantly accelerates decomposition. Combined with the fresh excavation we found there, it suggests someone had prepared a rather permanent resting place." The effect was immediate and revealing. Miss Thornfield's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her face draining of color as the implication struck home. "Dr. Fleming's original plan wasn't kidnapping," Miss Marple continued with quiet authority. "It was murder, immediate and final. He intended to bury Mrs. Ashworth in that greenhouse Tuesday night, using the ongoing renovation as perfect cover. But something, or rather someone, intervened to prevent that outcome. The truth emerges. Miss Thornfield's resistance finally crumbled under Miss Marple's gentle but relentless pressure. "I heard them arguing in the garden," she whispered, tears flowing freely for the first time since the investigation began. "I went out to see what was happening. He had his hands around her throat. She was already drugged from the cocoa, completely helpless. I screamed, told him I would call the police immediately." "But you didn't summon help," Inspector Craddock observed, his tone carefully neutral. "He gave me a choice," Miss Thornfield sobbed, her voice breaking with remembered terror. "He knew about the checks I'd been forging to pay my debts. He said if I helped him, he would cover the missing money and arrange for Mrs. Ashworth to recover in his private facility where she couldn't prosecute either of us. If I refused, he would kill her right there in the garden and frame me for everything, embezzlement and murder both." Miss Marple nodded with profound sadness rather than judgment. "So you helped him move her to his motor car instead of allowing him to bury her in the greenhouse. You saved her life that night, Catherine, though at a terrible personal cost." The revelation transformed everyone's understanding of the case's moral landscape. The heavy object Sally Briggs had witnessed wasn't a corpse being interred, but an unconscious woman being carried to a different kind of imprisonment, one that preserved her life while destroying her rescuer's integrity. Mrs. Ashworth's perspective. When Miss Marple visited Mrs. Ashworth at Much Benham General Hospital 2 days later, the formidable woman had regained much of her strength and all of her determination. Propped against pristine pillows, she received the news of Miss Thornfield's confession with characteristic pragmatism. "I suspected Fleming was poisoning me," Mrs. Ashworth explained, her voice hoarse but steady. The bitter almond taste in my evening cocoa was unmistakable. I'd watched my poor Robert die from that same flavor 15 years ago, but accusations against a respected physician require ironclad proof. I pretended to drink while actually disposing of the contents, hoping to catch him in the act while building my case through Silas Vane's investigation. Her strategy had been brilliant, but ultimately insufficient against Fleming's escalating desperation. When he realized I had compiled 15 years of evidence documenting his pattern of murders, he abandoned subtle poisoning for direct action. His medical expertise allowed him to maintain me in unconsciousness for days, but his arrogance prevented him from anticipating that I would hide my most damaging evidence in plain sight. She smiled weakly at Miss Marple's knowing expression. Robert's portrait, naturally. Fleming never understood that the most devastating proof wasn't Vane's investigation, but my own careful documentation. I had recorded every suspicious death, every patient complaint that preceded convenient natural causes. My husband's murder was merely the beginning of a pattern I spent 15 years confirming. The moral complexity. Miss Marple's final conversation with Miss Thornfield took place in the small interview room at Much Benham Police Station, where the companion awaited formal charging for her role in the conspiracy. Despite her legal jeopardy, Catherine Thornfield appeared oddly relieved to have the truth finally exposed. "I knew he couldn't keep her alive indefinitely," Miss Thornfield confessed quietly. "Every day I expected to hear that she had succumbed to her illness. That's why I left those clues. The button in the garden, the scarf near the quarry. I was trying to lead the investigation toward the truth without exposing my own complicity." "You were caught between impossible choices," Miss Marple acknowledged gently. "Fleming exploited your desperation and fear, making you complicit in order to save Mrs. Ashworth's life. It was a terrible, moral compromise, but one that ultimately preserved what mattered most. Justice and aftermath. The comprehensive investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Fleming's 15-year career in medical murder. 7 confirmed victims, each elderly, wealthy, and trusting. His methods varied from gradual poisoning disguised as natural decline to sudden cardiac events induced by carefully administered medications, always executed with the professional authority that prevented questioning. The financial trail proved equally damning. Fleming had systematically enriched himself through fraudulent insurance claims, forged medical certificates, and altered wills that directed substantial bequests to his fictitious charitable foundation. The amounts involved reached tens of thousands of pounds, funding an increasingly expensive lifestyle built upon the systematic exploitation of those who trusted him most completely. Miss Thornfield received a suspended sentence in recognition of her cooperation and the extraordinary circumstances that led to her involvement. The judge acknowledged that her actions, while legally culpable, had ultimately saved Mrs. Ashworth's life and led to Fleming's exposure. She departed Meadowbrook quietly, seeking employment in a distant county where her past wouldn't overshadow her future. David Ashworth's vindication brought him no satisfaction, only profound relief that his aunt had survived and gratitude that his innocent financial inquiries had inadvertently triggered the investigation that exposed Fleming's crimes. His relationship with Mrs. Ashworth, strengthened by shared trauma, would provide the foundation for rebuilding their family's trust and security. Miss Marple's reflection. As Miss Marple prepared to depart Meadowbrook and return to St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the case's particular complexities while packing her knitting bag with characteristic precision. The village would require years to recover from the revelation that their trusted physician had been systematically murdering patients, but the healing process had already begun with Fleming's removal and the establishment of proper medical oversight. The most dangerous criminals, she had observed to Inspector Craddock during their final consultation, are those who pervert positions of trust for personal gain. Fleming's crimes were possible precisely because his education and social standing placed him above suspicion. but they were ultimately stopped because one brave woman refused to accept convenient explanations and insisted on seeking truth regardless of personal cost. The case had demonstrated both the best and worst of human nature: Fleming's calculated malice, Miss Thornfield's desperate moral compromise, Mrs. Ashworth's determined courage, and David's loyal concern. Each had played their role in a drama that revealed how quickly respectability could mask monstrous evil, and how ordinary people could find extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded it. The lady who vanished after her final tea had returned to reclaim her life and ensure justice for her husband's death and those of Fleming's other victims. In Miss Marple's extensive experience of human nature at its most complex, such determined survival represented a profound victory over the arrogance of those who believed their position placed them above moral accountability. The truth, as always, had eventually emerged, not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient observation of the small inconsistencies that revealed larger patterns of deception and, ultimately, the complicated motivations that drove ordinary people to extraordinary acts of both evil and courage. 3 weeks after Dr. Fleming's arrest, Meadowbrook had begun the delicate process of healing, though the village would never entirely recover its former innocence. Miss Marple found herself invited to one final tea at Rosemere House, a gathering deliberately intimate and reflective, worlds away from the fateful Wednesday afternoon that had precipitated such extraordinary events. Mrs. Ashworth presided over her Georgian silver service with restored dignity, though subtle tremors in her hands betrayed the lingering effects of her ordeal. The formidable woman had insisted on hosting this particular gathering as both closure and acknowledgement of those whose actions had preserved her life. "I owe you a profound apology, Jane," Mrs. Ashworth began, her voice steady despite evident emotion. "My arrogance in believing I could handle Fleming's threat alone nearly cost everything. I was so determined to build an ironclad case that I underestimated his desperation." Miss Marple accepted her teacup with characteristic grace. "You demonstrated remarkable courage, Cordelia. Your documentation will ensure justice for Robert and Fleming's other victims, though I suspect your announcement about changing your will was deliberate provocation." A grim smile crossed Mrs. Ashworth's features. "Indeed, I knew he was monitoring my activities, waiting for opportunity. By announcing my intention to meet with Pettigrew the following morning, I created a deadline that would force precipitous action. I expected poisoning that evening, which would have provided the evidence I needed. I never anticipated he would abandon subtlety for direct violence." David Ashworth sat near the window, his relationship with his aunt transformed by shared trauma. The financial difficulties that had brought him to Rosemere House were being resolved through honest work rather than inheritance expectations, and the suspicion that had poisoned their relationship had been replaced by genuine mutual respect. "I've accepted a permanent position with the Much Benham firm," he announced quietly. "I find I no longer enjoy business where figures on paper matter more than people. This ordeal has taught me the difference between entitlement and responsibility." Their conversation turned to Miss Thornfield, whose fate had been determined with surprising judicial compassion. Mrs. Ashworth had testified on her behalf, acknowledging that Catherine's intervention had prevented immediate murder despite the moral compromises that followed. "I've arranged employment for her in Edinburgh," Mrs. Ashworth revealed. "She deserves a fresh start, away from these shadows. Her embezzlement was driven by desperation, not greed, and she ultimately chose to save my life despite enormous personal risk. I cannot forgive her completely, but neither can I ignore that debt." Inspector Craddock's final report had revealed the full scope of Fleming's 15-year career in medical murder. 7 confirmed victims, each eliminated when they questioned his authority or threatened his reputation. His journals showed a chilling progression from opportunistic murder to systematic predation, with each success reinforcing his sense of invulnerability. "The most disturbing aspect," Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, was Fleming's twisted justification through medical ethics. He convinced himself that eliminating difficult patients served some greater good. Such rationalization is characteristic of intelligent criminals who cannot acknowledge their own moral bankruptcy. Miss Pemberton, representing the village's collective conscience, stirred her tea thoughtfully. Meadowbrook is struggling with the revelation that we trusted him so completely. It's sobering to realize how easily respectability can mask evil. That's precisely what makes such criminals dangerous, Miss Marple replied. Fleming exploited our natural tendency to trust authority figures. His medical knowledge provided both means and cover, while his social standing prevented the scrutiny that might have exposed him years earlier. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Rosemere House's gardens, Mrs. Ashworth announced her decision to establish a foundation in Robert's memory, funding independent medical oversight and supporting patients who questioned their treatment. The old greenhouse, once intended as her grave, had been dismantled and replaced with a new rose garden that would bloom in spring, a fitting metaphor for clearing away structures of deception to make way for honest growth. Miss Marple departed Meadowbrook the following morning as church bells chimed their familiar rhythm and daily life resumed its comfortable patterns. Yet beneath that tranquil surface, the community carried new awareness of how fragile trust could be, and how vigilance remained necessary even in the most respectable surroundings. As her train pulled away from the station, Miss Marple reflected that human nature remained the greatest mystery of all, capable of terrible darkness, but also, as this case had proven, of resilient and enduring light. The lady who vanished after her final tea had returned to reclaim her life and ensure that justice, in its own quiet way, had been served. Outside the carriage window, Meadowbrook receded into memory, church spire, tiled roofs, and the faint outline of Rosemere House among winter trees. It would heal, absorbing its scandal into the deep, layered memory of villages everywhere, where the eternal patterns of human nature played out in endless, fascinating variation. Miss Marple smiled and counted stitches, knowing that wherever people lived together, there would always be secrets beneath polite conversation, and someone willing to notice when small, displaced details revealed darker truths lurking beneath respectability's carefully maintained surface. The weeks following Miss Marple's departure from Meadowbrook passed in the gentle rhythm of St. Mary Mead's familiar routines, though she found herself reflecting often on the extraordinary events that had unfolded in that seemingly tranquil village. As autumn deepened into winter, the case settled into her memory alongside dozens of others, each a testament to the endless complexity of human nature and the particular dangers that arose when evil cloaked itself in respectability. The healing process. Letters from Meadowbrook arrived with reassuring regularity, chronicling the village's gradual recovery from Fleming's devastating betrayal. Mrs. Ashworth had returned to Rosemere House with characteristic determination, though those closest to her noted subtle changes in her manner, a wariness that hadn't existed before, tempered by profound gratitude for her survival. The old greenhouse had been demolished entirely, replaced by a memorial garden where white roses would bloom in spring, honoring both her late husband and Fleming's other victims. Most touching to Miss Marple were the carefully written letters from Catherine Thornfield in Edinburgh. The former companion's correspondence revealed a woman working diligently to rebuild her life on honest foundations, despite the shadows of her past. I've secured employment as a bookkeeper for a small charitable organization. One letter reported, "The work is modest but satisfying, and my employer knows nothing of my difficulties in Meadowbrook. I find I sleep better now, knowing that every figure I record is truthful. Sometimes I cannot bear to handle a checkbook, but then I remember that avoiding things is precisely what led me astray. I mean to live honestly, if I must live very quietly indeed." Raymond's visit. It was during one of Raymond West's weekend visits that Miss Marple finally discussed the finer details of the case with her novelist nephew. They sat by the fire in her drawing room, Raymond's natural skepticism providing the perfect foil for her explanations. "The business with the button in the garden troubles me, Aunt Jane," Raymond admitted, selecting a chocolate with his usual critical precision. "Surely that was rather clumsy for someone of Fleming's intelligence?" Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. "On the contrary, dear, the button was not clumsy. It was desperate. When I found that pearl button placed so precisely beneath the climbing rose, I knew immediately we were dealing with manufactured evidence. Mrs. Ashworth would never have worn her best gloves for gardening, nor would she have lost a button without noticing immediately. Someone needed us to believe in a struggle that had never occurred." "And the bitter almonds at the clinic," Raymond pressed. "Craddock mentioned you detected cyanide." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with sudden mischief. "I smelled nothing of the sort, Raymond. The clinic smelled entirely of antiseptic and floor wax. But I knew from Mrs. Ashworth's diary that she associated that scent with her husband's murder. By mentioning it, I wasn't identifying a chemical, I was resurrecting a ghost. Fleming panicked because he thought I knew everything, when in reality, I only knew human nature. The psychology of professional evil." As their conversation deepened, Miss Marple shared her analysis of Fleming's particular brand of criminality. His 15-year career in murder represented something far more chilling than crimes of passion or desperation. It was evil systematized, made routine through professional authority and social respectability. Fleming suffered from that form of arrogance often found in professional men who have gone unchallenged too long, she explained, her voice taking on the gentle but implacable tone Raymond had learned to recognize. He didn't merely want to silence Mrs. Ashworth, he wanted to defeat her. His vanity demanded that he prove his intellectual superiority, even while committing murder. The case had demonstrated once again how society's reluctance to suspect those in positions of authority created perfect cover for systematic predation. Fleming had understood instinctively how to weaponize respectability, using his medical knowledge and social standing to render victims helpless while maintaining the appearance of devoted physician. 7 patients dying under his care within 15 years, Miss Marple observed, each death occurring shortly after they questioned his treatment. The statistical improbabilities should have triggered investigation years earlier, yet his professional standing rendered him effectively invisible to scrutiny. The broader implications. What troubled Miss Marple most profoundly was the collective failure of Meadowbrook's community to recognize warning patterns that, in retrospect, seemed glaringly obvious. This phenomenon reminded her of similar cases throughout her observational career, trusted figures exploiting their positions for personal gain, while their respectability shielded them from suspicion. "Evil rarely appears in dramatic form," she told Raymond, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "More often it is small things, petty cruelties, tiny compromises, little acts of cowardice that accumulate over time. Fleming began with a single murder to protect his reputation, but each success reinforced his sense of invulnerability until elimination became his standard solution to difficult patients. Yet the case had also revealed the resilience of human courage when confronted with monstrous deception. Mrs. Ashworth's 15-year investigation, Catherine Thornfield's desperate intervention that prevented immediate murder, even David's innocent financial inquiries that had inadvertently exposed the truth, each represented ordinary people finding extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded it. Justice and human nature. As evening shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the particular satisfaction this case provided. Fleming's comprehensive confession had ensured justice not only for Mrs. Ashworth, but for all his victims, their families finally receiving answers to questions that had haunted them for years. The physician's detailed journals would serve as evidence in related investigations, potentially exposing additional crimes and preventing future predation. "The most dangerous criminals," she observed to Raymond, "are those who believe their education and position place them above moral accountability. Fleming's crimes were possible precisely because he understood how to exploit trust systematically. But such arrogance eventually breeds carelessness, and patient observation will always reveal the patterns that expose even the most careful deception. Final reflections. As Raymond prepared to return to London the following morning, Miss Marple walked with him to the garden gate, her thoughts turning once more to Meadowbrook and the lessons its tragedy had provided. The village would heal, absorbing its scandal into the deep, layered memory of communities everywhere, where the eternal patterns of human nature played out in endless, fascinating variation. The lady who vanished after her final tea had survived to tell her story, ensuring that Fleming's victims would finally receive justice and that future patients would be protected from similar exploitation. In Miss Marple's extensive experience with human evil and human courage, such outcomes represented the best that could be hoped for, not perfect resolution, but honest acknowledgement of what had occurred and determined effort to prevent its repetition. Standing in her garden as Raymond's motorcar disappeared down the lane, Miss Marple reflected that she was profoundly glad to return to St. Mary Mead's comfortable routines. Yet she carried with her the knowledge that human nature remained endlessly complex, that evil could flourish in the most respectable surroundings, and that vigilance, gentle, persistent, observant vigilance, remained humanity's best defense against those who believed their position placed them beyond the reach of justice. The mystery was solved, the criminal exposed, and life would continue its eternal patterns. But somewhere in her knitting bag, alongside wool and needles, lay the small notebook where she recorded observations about human nature in all its fascinating complexity. Meadowbrook had become another entry in that private catalogue, a reminder that beneath every village's tranquil surface lurked the same fundamental truths about greed, fear, courage, and the endless struggle between good and evil that had defined human communities since civilization began. Miss Marple smiled and resumed her knitting, knowing that wherever people lived together, there would always be secrets beneath polite conversation, and someone willing to notice when small, displaced details revealed the larger truths lurking beneath respectability's carefully maintained surface.